So, welcome, Howard Williamson, to the Frankly Speaking Live series. So this morning, I'd like to ask Howard to introduce himself briefly and tell us some words about himself and his involvement in the European Youth Field and the Third European Youth Work Convention.
Thank you, Yael. Hello, and this is good to contribute to this. It's always very difficult to talk about background. I mean, I started as a modest youth worker almost accidentally, and actually most of my life has been an accident. There's never been a plan or a set of aspirations. Things have unfolded, and when they've unfolded, I've tried to seize the moment, and I've tried to do them quite well. And that has led to a continuation of practice involvement as a youth worker. I ran a youth centre in England for 25 years. But in the 70s, I started to get involved in youth research, largely through staying on at university to do a PhD, again, an accident, not a plan. And then I started studying the Milltown Boys, which I've continued to study right up to today, so for nearly 50 years. And I carried on doing lots of bits and pieces of youth research, which at the time people thought was I was a kind of odd job university person. But looking back, it equipped me with a fantastic wealth of understanding and information on a whole range of youth questions, from homelessness to entrepreneurship, to young people in public care, crime, deviance, unemployment, and so on and so forth. And then I think I was kind of identified in the early 1980s as a young possible policy contributor. And so I was drawn in to chair a HIV and drug prevention committee in 1985 in International Youth Year. And then 3 years later, I became the chair of the Wales Youth Work Partnership, so a national appointment. I was already sitting on the national, which actually meant England, not the Welsh nation, the National Advisory Committee on Youth Research from 1978. I'd already been advising the government on anti-youth unemployment programs in the late 70s and early 80s. And then in the late 80s, it was a kind of, was I going to live on a park bench or become famous? And it still wasn't very clear. And then I got invited to Denmark to speak at a vocational training conference, actually a European one. Felt completely out of my depth, completely sort of bemused by all these international characters. I had been to Strasbourg a couple of times to Council of Europe events, and again, I felt equally bemused and overwhelmed by Eurospeak and these people who seemed to know so much more than I did about everything about Europe, because all I really knew about was England and the United Kingdom. And then in the 90s, it all kind of took off, really. I started to be involved in international research and international policy activity to the point where within a short space of time, I was involved in the Council of Europe International Youth Policy Reviews and helping the development of the EU's White Paper on Youth in 2001. And in the last 20 years, I've been heavily involved in lots of different ways in different countries in policy research and practice.
Yeah, that's where we got to know each other in the context
Indeed.
of the European youth sector. So you were if I understood correctly, you were the rapporteur, right, at the European Youth Work Convention, which means you chaired and facilitated the steering group that developed the declaration, and had quite a lot of input or significant input into its content. So can you tell us a little bit more about the convention? I'm particularly interested in your sort of big takeaway. What did you hear at the convention, or did you hear something at the convention that you think from a conceptual point of view is particularly interesting and promising for the European youth field going forward?
Well, you probably won't thank me for this, but I think we need to talk about the conventions in plural. Mm-hmm. And I think we ought to disabuse ourselves of the fact that I chaired the drafting group. I did not do that. Okay. I think I was originally asked to be the rapporteur general, but then I started to become called the research advisor or the academic advisor, and it wasn't quite clear what my role was, but I did cast myself in the role as the servant of the drafting group. They were the experts in their particular areas, but they were not the advocates of their particular areas. You know, they in turn were the servants of the findings of the convention and the discussion of the convention. So I think we need to be kind of clear about that, because I had been the rapporteur general for the previous two conventions, and there I did have a more I don't know whether directive role or anchoring or facilitating role. You know, I was the typist in effect. I typed all the declarations, and I think you need to go back 12 years. And I won't go into a lot of detail, but the first convention was stitched up. It was an idea. I mean, it was my idea to call it a convention, actually, because I thought that sounded rather grander than a conference and a bit less academic than a symposium. I suggested we called it a Youth Work Convention, and then it was driven forward by the Youth Partnership and by the Flemish government for the EU presidency of Belgium in 2010. And then we had to take a next step after a kind of professional gathering and a professional declaration to take it into the political arena and get a kind of a resolution on youth work by the EU. 5 years later, I'd already pointed out that celebrating the diversity of youth work was a kind of kiss of death politically. You know, it was nobody understood what we were doing. What was the point? We were living in post-global banking crisis austerity. People wanted to have a much clearer understanding of what this youth work stuff was if they were going to support it. So I suggested we might need another convention. And the opportune moment arose when Belgium once again had the chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe in 2015. Once again, they asked me to be the rapporteur general. Once again, I wrote a sort of position paper for the start of it called Finding Common Ground. And it was about trying to bring the youth work community together to see whether they really did agree on anything, because it wasn't clear that they did agree on anything. They had it was quite a battleground, the youth work sector. To my surprise and satisfaction, they did come up with some common ground, and that enabled the next 5 years, taking us up to today, for at least a path to be identified where people from different backgrounds in youth work could come together and try to share an agreed direction. So the recommendation on youth work in 2017 by the Council of Europe, we'd also, that was taking the professional conclusions of 2015 into the political arena, but through the Council of Europe on the basis of the foundation of the convention within the chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers. And I think the significant change there, you asked about the takeaway, was that suddenly youth work was kind of on the map and it was being debated politically. So under the German presidency last year in 2020, there was less need for the professionals to secure a political anchoring, because the political anchoring was already in process within the German presidency. But it did require a different way of thinking about what we were going to talk about, because the political framework was set. So there was a bit of mischief, I suppose, within the convention, because on the one hand, it was opening it up to a vast number of people because it was done online. On the other hand, it wasn't saying you still have a blank sheet of paper, which we had in 2010 and 2015. It was much more about saying a European Youth Work agenda has been agreed by the European Union, certainly, and almost certainly supported. It wasn't quite as clear, but by the Council of Europe. And we need to try and work out how we map out what that agenda is in order to take something called the Bonn process forward. And as you know, and I think other people know, the Council conclusions from early December, the political side of the youth work agenda, had the 5 C's, the points about concept and competence and connection, and I'm trying to think of what the other one was, but and then there was the crisis of the pandemic, and these were headlines that I'd put in a preliminary paper for this convention And I still think they need resolving. And I think they are the tensions and the fault lines in the rather happy family that has emerged since December with the declaration, which is, I think, a good declaration. But I think just beneath the happy family is still quite a lot of tension within the youth work community. And I'm not calling it a community of practice at the moment.
Okay, so let's rewind to this question around the bond process, because we've just been talking about politics and policy. And so this new thing, the bond process, do you see any specific potentials? Do you see any specific dangers in or challenges going forward?
Well, the huge challenge is doing anything. It's actually finding the resources to do something. As I said in the opening speech of the third convention, my opening speech, and trying to draw on statements that had been made in the two institutions and been made by the German presidency about the wind in our back. It's time to act. There's a lot of these lovely cliches, even the title of the declaration, signposts for the future, let's step forward, the kind of metaphor of the yellow brick road and, all marching together. I think that there's a huge risk of this remaining at a sort of rhetorical device at a European level, not really being taken forward at national level, because ultimately youth work delivery has to be relatively local. It has to at least build from the local or be delivered at the local. And if you don't have the infrastructure at the local level, then it's not going to happen. It's just going to be nice, warm words, or it's going to be colonized and controlled by a particular form of youth work, namely international youth work. So I think there's a lot of difficulties in thinking about the bond process. Having said that, I'm an optimist. I mean, I often say to people, why would I have stuck around for so long in the youth sector if I did not believe that things do really happen? I mean, I wouldn't have wasted my time. And it's very easy to get cynical and get suspicious and get critical. I think that the European Youth Work agenda and the bond process have put a kind of political umbrella over youth work. They've given an opportunity for member states to refer to it as a kind of driver of their own more local national agendas. And they have highlighted things that need to be done, such as the education and training of youth workers, such as trying to identify a kind of what constitutes a local youth work offer, such as making the stronger connections with other areas of policy affecting young people, like health and justice and employment and education, formal education, and so on and so forth. So I think, it's another kind of kick up the backside to get thinking a bit deeper and a bit harder about what youth work is, where it fits, and how we make it happen for young people and stop just writing documents about it, which we now have a lot about. But 20 years ago, we had very little. So
That's right.
That's the achievement, that we now have a debate and we have a lot of material to help people take that debate and the action forward.
Indeed. I mean, if there's one potential that I see in this bond process is, of course, that the how would I say, this joined up inclusive debate actually is put on some kind of footing. Of course, that requires a lot of groundwork and it requires political will. But I think it's been announced in some ways through this idea of the agenda. So going back a step again and talking a little bit about ideas. You mentioned community of practice earlier on, and you also mentioned the idea of common ground. And I'd like to hear more about how you understand that, the relationship between the two, each of those things separately.
Well, it's a bit of a mischievous question, dear Yael, because you were the person who introduced the idea of community of practice in an early meeting around the Council of Europe agenda, Council of Europe Youth Sector Agenda 2030. And when the very first meeting that sort of started that process going, you talked about community of practice. And I thought it was a great idea at the time. Now, we know there's a sort of formal definitional approach to the community of practice with Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger, and Wenger, and there are, and this is really about a kind of ideological unity of people working together. And I'm not convinced that the youth work sector really constitutes a community of practice in that formal sense. On the other hand, I think it's quite useful to try to talk about the youth work sector, however defined, however large or small it may be, as a community of practice, because I think that's the reward we should reap from the 2015 convention, when we did identify common ground. I had every expectation in 2015 that we would blow apart. I mean, there is a massive gulf between the kind of ideas about youth work held by the European Youth Forum, self-governed youth organizations having autonomy and control, not formally trained or qualified in any way in youth work, but what they claim is doing a lot of very important and useful youth work. And then you've got street-based work, and you've got project-based work. And you and I, many years ago, when we were doing the Youth Policy Review of Cyprus, had a small exchange of views where your notion of youth work was very clearly an international form of youth work, and my version of youth work at that time was still fairly anchored in centre-based British kind of youth work, where you open the doors 3 nights a week to a bunch of teenagers who come in and play pool, and then you build relationships with them, and you open them to new experiences and opportunities. So and in a way, that little moment in Cyprus in the middle of the early 2000s was a moment where you start to have to think, well, what are the bridges between those two forms of youth work?
Exactly.
Can you really call them, but both of those things and the other many manifestations of youth work, can you really call them all youth work? And so the common ground idea was, when you brought 500 people who all claimed to be youth workers together in Brussels, did they really share anything at all? I mean, youth workers are brilliant at internal divisions. I mean, brilliant at internal disagreements about what the philosophy of youth work is, what its objectives are. You've written recently about its politicization. Some people don't think youth work's political at all. It's a kind of activity-based process. It's not about raising questions of inequality or challenging inequality or structural disadvantages and so on and so forth. But anyway, I think to my delight, really, after 3 days of the cut and thrust of discussion, they did come up with common ground. And, it's simplistic in a way, but the idea of that all youth work, irrespective of where it takes place, who's doing it, is about winning spaces for young people's voice and participation, plus building bridges, not to employability and the labour market, which is always a risk of youth work being sucked into that particular agenda, but about bridges, what I call purposeful and constructive bridges to the next steps, next positive steps in young people's lives, whether that's to do with family or leisure or employment or something else. Spaces and bridges as the two sort of takeaways from that convention that we all share, and the challenges that were identified as well at convention about multiculturalism in Europe, particularly faith fault lines around radicalization. These are all words that really require a lot of unraveling and unpicking. But extremism. We'd had Breivik. We've got the migration crisis. All of these things were going to really throw up new challenges for youth work. And then the other thing was technology, which has also been a massive challenge for youth work, particularly within the pandemic. So I think 2015 was a moment where the youth work community, and if I want to add in brackets of practice, did come together to identify a shared territory that was a bit different from formal education, was a bit different from careers counselling, was a bit different from other parts of work with young people that sometimes is mistakenly connected to something called youth work.
Interestingly, actually, in what you're saying there, I mean, you've just made a very strong case for the idea of, you know, the common ground and the things that we have in common as a community of practice, being political. I mean, what you talked about, the idea that what we have in common is a certain kind of idealism, a certain kind of ambition, a certain kind of expansion of, in a way, rights or if not expansion of rights, but you know, an implementation of rights for young people, with young people on their own behalf. And so I'm really interested in hearing what you think has been the let's say the development since that convention, and not just in political terms but also conceptually for that idea of the common ground. I mean, have we come any further with understanding that? Have we come any further with documenting that? Have we come any further with creating awareness for how that might be operationalized in youth work practice, for example? I'd be really interested in hearing some more about that.
Well, I think the politics of youth work, if we can sort of wrap up your question in that, or put it into that box, it's always a very thorny issue. It's always a very, very contentious issue. You know, one of the first sort of pieces of writing from the UK on youth work was called "The Politics of Youth Clubs." You know, are youth clubs actually about politics? You know, what is politics? Then there was a quite unknown book by somebody called Kumkum Bhavnani, which was about young people talking politics. That was the title of the book, and she defined politics as the contestation and regulation of unequal power relationships.
Absolutely.
And so youth work is inherently political. I mean, if you're dealing with young women who come into your youth club, your open youth centre, who are, you know, I don't tend to use the jargon, you know, but are oppressed by patriarchal family relationships. In other words, you hear about the way their fathers or their brothers treat them. You've got no choice but to engage with them on that kind of issue. You know, youth unemployment, the sacrifices, a word used in the Council of Europe some years ago, the young generation sacrificed, but the disproportionate disadvantages being visited on young people by the labour market and those sorts of, you know, it's constantly political. On the other hand, youth workers have to be quite careful not to appear to be sort of trapped in party politics.
Yeah.
And there's also a kind of Goffman-esque front of shop, back of shop story about youth work that, of course, you'll have private conversations with young people and indeed with youth work colleagues. But I once wrote a sort of anti-political chapter in a book where I said youth workers should not use young people in their own political games, which, you know, there are opportunities in local life for young people which may not be ideal. They may not be what we want. They may be considered by us with more political understanding as sort of exploitative and so on, but they may be the only chances those kids have got. So we have to also recognise a sort of realpolitik of what is around for young people, and youth workers have a job to do to support young people in understanding the choices they may make within that environment, and, you know, not passing judgment. I mean, again, I wrote an article long ago in 1983, I think, called "A Duty to Explain," that which was really about government training programs. And I said, if a youth worker tells all the kids in their youth project or whatever it is that this is a Thatcherite conspiracy to exploit young people, then almost certainly that youth worker will be visited by a parent who shouts at them and says, "This is the only chance my son or daughter has." Yeah. On the other hand, if you celebrate and say this is the most wonderful opportunity to bridge the transition from school to work, you'll almost certainly be visited by some ardent trade unionist who says, what are you doing encouraging my kid to go on a cheap Labour Thatcherite government training programme? So all the time you're having to juggle, and and if we're too explicit about it, we run the risk of politicians trying to get their own back on youth work. And actually, I'm witnessing that right now, because a rather unpleasant Conservative member of Parliament, we're campaigning about the UK leaving Erasmus Plus, and the British or English or UK government has established something called the Touring Programme, which is for higher education. But we're looking at how we develop parallel and equivalent opportunities for the youth side of Erasmus Plus. And some rather vicious letters have come back to youth organisations saying, are you aware that you are funded by taxpayers' money, and are those funders aware that you are using their resources to campaign against the government? So it's a tightrope. I mean, a lot of youth work. Philip Gousset and I wrote an article saying youth work are probably the hardest job in the world, and it was a little tongue-in-cheek. But most other professions and most other professional activity, that's not necessarily professionalized activity, has a fairly clear sort of set of parameters around it. Social work or teaching, there are certain expectations, there are boundaries that are very clear. Those boundaries are not clear at all in youth work, and every youth worker has to make judgments about where they want to set the boundaries. Mm.
You've just defined what I have been talking about in What's Politics Got to Do with It as the political literacy of youth work and the youth work profession, or the youth work community of practice, actually, and something that that unfortunately we find is not always particularly well developed. I mean, even an awareness that one needs that kind of political literacy. One needs to have those ethical debates with oneself and with one's colleagues. The ethics of youth work tend to be around let's say the relational dimension of youth work in practice. I mean, how do I relate to, young people who develop the God complex around the youth worker, or try to develop relationships with the youth worker? The ethics are, how do I deal with the emotional needs of young people? But this political dimension of ethics is often relatively weakly articulated in discussions in youth work training, or in youth work debate. Full stop. About how to do it, as it were.
If I could just sort of jump in just quickly with a comment on that, because you mentioned youth work ethics, and there is a book called Youth Work Ethics by Howard Sercombe, and there was a very interesting youth work conference held in the UK a few years ago, where in the morning there were a lot of very sort of luminary youth work experts, academics, a guy called Bart Hirsch from America and Howard Sercombe. And they talked all about the grand ideas about youth work and about challenging inequality and all the kind of things that you've just alluded to. And then there was a lunch break. And then in the afternoon, there was sort of stories from local practice. And it was basically a bunch of people who were saying, I take kids up mountains, or I do a smoking cessation project, or and it was just about a delivery of practice that was completely atheoretical, completely apolitical. And I wrote an article then about some youth workers are from Venus and some are from Mars.
I love it.
and actually we all live on the same planet. But I was trying to work out how these two stories from youth work fitted with each other, connected to each other. And my conclusion was that they didn't. Largely, they did not.
Yeah, I think that's partially true. But at the same time, I also have the impression that in particular circles, now I'm obviously again still talking from the perspective of an international youth work circle, which is a bit particular and doesn't necessarily always have direct, direct relation and direct practice feed in from that that very local dimension. But often it's really interesting to note how the self-perception is different, right? So despite the fact that the evidence, anecdotal or otherwise, we don't have a lot of studies about it, but the anecdotal evidence says, that's not really the case. The self-perception is that it is the case. And I think this is a significant challenge in the youth work community of practice in terms of really understanding what their possible impact is, how they can improve the lot of young people through the work that they're doing. I think you see it extensively in the programs, right? Because that kind of thinking really passes into what can be funded, what cannot be funded. The different, it's not only about the big bad government now, or governments, in this case the European Council, who determines what can be funded and what cannot be funded in the European youth work programs. I think it's also about sort of where we see the boundaries of our imagination, what the boundaries of our imagination with regard to the potential of youth work and its processes and the things that it's supposed to be doing is. But you mentioned research, and I think this is a wonderful segue to the next thing I wanted to discuss with you, and that is that you've been for many years involved in RC 34 of the International Research Committee 34 of the International Sociological Association, which I believe is just called Youth, and they've just had another meeting, and I'd be really interested to hear some more about sort of what's going on in youth research right now, as far as you can tell, and what do you think is interesting?
Well, I have just sat through 95 papers in 6 days, 22 sessions of the youth part of the ISA World Forum of Sociology program, which I'm on the program committee of, so I feel some sort of obligation to support my colleagues and listen to them. Of course, occasionally, actually quite frequently, you're pleasantly surprised and you think, wow, that really is something else, a great piece of research, either because of the focus or because of the methodology or some other reason, or just the sheer quality of the presentation. Having said that, there's also deep frustrations. I've always taken issue with the concept of gangs, for example. And there were a couple of sessions on gangs in Latin America and North Africa and Europe and obviously America. But a lot of the speakers were talking about trying to get rid of the concept of gang. They felt this was a kind of very American idea. And yet the whole damn project is called the Trans Gang Network. A lot of criminologists are very keen to keep using the word gang because it attracts the media, when in fact we're talking about street groups of young people, young people who may be unemployed, hanging around in public space, perhaps being creative with arts and culture, graffiti, sometimes political, sometimes not, sometimes more entrepreneurial and looking at, making some money somehow. So that was, that's one sort of paradox, I think, that prevails in the youth research agenda. I think one of the sadnesses for me is that everybody talks all the time about intersectionality, interdependency, everything's connected, and then they immediately dive into very parochial, narrow-based issues, studies of, either young women or minorities or migrants or around a particular issue like employment or domestic life or violence. And they've just told everybody that everything's connected, and then they make no connections at all. And sometimes I think that their research account says much more about their PhD supervisor and the institution where they actually are working and the sort of cultural traditions of that place, rather than anything about the subject that they're talking about. And it's rather, as I once said very critically about the youth policy reviews, that sometimes the youth policy reviews told us more about the researcher who'd written the report than it did about the country that was under review. So those are pretty scathing remarks. I'm still really trying to digest and process those 95 papers. I've got about 50 pages of handwritten notes from those presentations and lots of supplementary notes that I've scribbled in the margin. I myself, of course, have done this research on these Milltown boys, and I'm just writing the book about them, or they're soon to be published. And one of the points I'm making very forcefully in that, and I'm not really a theoretician, is how private lives influence public decisions, how these links between families and relationships and children and parents and connect to issues about jobs and drugs and health and justice and illegality. It overlaps in very, very complex ways. And we don't do young people any favors by trying to drill it down into fairly simplified and siloed explanations. So, looking at transition from school to work amongst a group of young men in Austria, age 16 to 18, probably doesn't tell us very much about where they're going to be at age 30. All kinds of factors intrude. And I'm not over celebrating my own work, but I would like to see much more recognition that a lot of these things cannot be simplified as far as they have been in youth research. And one of our agendas for next year, actually in Melbourne, where the World Congress of Sociology is being held, is to strengthen those connections. The final thing I would want to inject into this discussion is that there is a huge debate going on about whether the theories of the global north have any purchase and relevance in the global south. Australia, the UK and America have really driven the literature and the ideas about youth research. I mean, I know that you'll tell me there's some German literature and some, but by and large, people make a lot of reference to British, American and Australian literature. And whether that really stands up in Vietnam or in South Africa or in Argentina is another question. And so that debate is ongoing. There were a few sessions about that at the forum. And it's really about whether the global south need a different set of theories, whether they need to adapt northern theories to make them more relevant around transitions, around vulnerability, around precarity. I mean, precarious youth in our terms would apply to nearly everybody in Namibia, for example. Or whether we need to bounce one from the other, because as I contributed to one of those sessions on global south, global north theory, I said that the precarious lifetime experience of the Milltown boys that I've studied are just now being visited on a much greater population in the global north. So the uncertainties and precariousness for relatively privileged global north young people, new experience for them, but they've been a typical commonplace experience for similar young people in the global south. I'm supervising a PhD about middle class young people failing to find dependent work and therefore looking to entrepreneurship in Malawi. That's one of the things that I'm involved in at the moment. So those are the kind of debates that are going on, but you can find a bit of everything there. And I think I suppose the more generic remark I would want to make is that I'm not expecting every youth work or youth sector individual to have a encyclopedic knowledge of academic research on young people's lives. But I do worry sometimes when I find people in the youth sector doing rather half-baked little pieces on, youth unemployment, when there is a huge, excellent body of understanding being produced in universities in Europe around youth unemployment, labour markets, and so on. But those labour market people don't know anything about the youth sector. So that's one of our critical connections that we need to strengthen.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I found it super interesting what you said about this idea that, the jargon of not just the research community. I think it's also very much present in policy and practice around something like intersectionality. And this idea of, you know, siloed thinking and drilling down into sort of bite-sized pieces, which we then study ad nauseum, and how that to some extent has ended up, because of this mantra, we need evidence on which to base our policies, how this in some ways, you know, backfires, right? And what do I mean by backfiring? I mean the way that, for example, certain kinds of terminology end up creating even more stigma for exactly the young people that stigma and disadvantage for exactly the young people that initially those terms were supposed to help emancipate, or you know, were supposed to inform policies that in the end were supposed to support those young people. And I think about a term, for example, like radicalization, right? How in some respects, you know, that has become it's become weaponized. I don't like that jargon either, but it's become weaponized. I really wonder where you know, youth research stands on that particular thing. You know, this thing about, you know, the transmission of concepts and ideas that you know, had a different background and into the policy domain, right? And what happens then with exactly that stuff in the policy domain and in programs, and therefore the effects then on young people. How do researchers feel about their co-responsibility in that?
Co-responsibility. It's strange. When I first went to Strasbourg in the middle of the 1980s, one of the people who was also there was a legendary British sociologist called Paul Willis, who'd written a legendary book called Learning to Labour. And shortly after that, he was involved in writing something called the Youth Review, which was how the local state might protect young people from the ravages of national state policies, really. Paul was there to really promote his report, The Social Condition of Young People in Wolverhampton in 1984. That was its sexy title. And Paul and I went for a coffee, and I said, where do you see the borderline between doing research and being a kind of activist, a political activist? And he made the very interesting remark to me that he wrote books and then other people read them and interpreted them, and he had no control and no influence and no particular interest in how they were used, that he did the research. And I remember saying to him in that cafe in the Palace of Europe in 1985, 86, saying, I feel you need to go further than that. You need to actually engage with the politicians. You need to look at the practice. You need to shout loud when the practice has distorted what, I mean, academic life is now quite preoccupied with impact. Well, if my own historical research was analysed for impact, the most impactful bit of my research was the NEET, the Not in Education, Employment or Training Young People, where I wrote about them in the 80s. I did research in the early 90s. I had many political arguments. I took it into government policy in the middle of the 1990s. The term NEET was constructed by a civil servant on March the 27th, 1996. It's etched in my mind. I like the guy. He said my term status zero had also become misused. My term status zero was about a metaphor for young people counting for nothing and going nowhere. That was the idea. And it was a technical term originally. It was the status naught. And then 1 was those who stayed in education, and 2 were those who went into training, and 3 were those who got a job, and naught were the ones who didn't get anything. So I converted that to ZER naught, 0. But I'm not sure whether I want to be credited with being, as some people have referred to me, the founding father of the NEEPs. I hate that expression. But it's a truth, and there's a limit to how much you can influence the politics.
Yeah.
The Commission has the youth guarantee, and as I have often written, guarantees guarantee nothing. It depends on what the nature of the guarantee is and how meaningful and relevant it is to young people. And here, it's a very good illustration of the complexity that I was trying to talk about that needs to be debated, because I'm not hostile to a youth training guarantee. I think we do need a guarantee of something, education, training or employment for young people who are unemployed after 4 months or 6 months or whatever whatever is possible in terms of resources and so on. We know the scarring effects for young people who are excluded from labour market and learning in their early young adult years. The scarring effects are dreadful over the lifetime. But equally, guarantees don't create jobs.
No.
So
exactly.
Sometimes people come into the guarantee experience and then are unemployed again. And then people say the guarantee has failed. It has not failed. The guarantee still needs to be there. So you get these kind of paradoxical things that the guarantee, and I know this because in the 80s, the British government had a youth training guarantee that I was scathing about in some respects, but also very supportive of in other respects. When I was scathing of it, government hated me. And when I was supportive of it, the field hated me. But I recognised, because I was still running a youth centre, I knew what those guarantees meant to some of the young people I was working with. It gave them some belief that they were still wanted in the labour market in some modest kind of way, when they were already starting to feel abandoned and excluded before they'd even got a foot on the ladder.
Yeah. Actually, I'm really fascinated by this discussion also from the perspective of historical memory, right? And really from this perspective of historical and institutional memory, and how would I say, community memory, because you also mentioned previously when you were talking about this kind of debate that exists between the global South and the global North on theory building and what's appropriate and what we need and what we don't need in the youth sector. And it occurred to me when you were talking about that especially in relation to particular subjects, right, that you talked about it in relation to youth unemployment, you talked about radicalization, but that we neither the youth sector as a whole nor individual research communities or practice communities have a very good historical memory, right? Because it's not like the 1980s didn't produce absolutely stellar research into extremism, right, of different kinds. Actually, it was mostly right-wing radicalization at the time, and about extraction of young people from those movements, how they work on young people, why they get involved, how they get out of it, and whatever. And in parallel, the work on religious sects, right? And in terms of the work that has been done in the last, especially 15 years on radicalization, none of that work has been referenced, right? Because of this focus on Islamic radicalization and sort of preventing terrorism, right? So I find it really I find it really interesting to talk to you about many of these things, because you have a very conscious way of involving previous knowledge, right? A historicization. And I wonder whether that is also a really crucial part of this political literacy for the community of practice, because I don't think you can tell the story exclusively from the moment you discovered it, right? I think the story builds, right? And our knowledge and our understanding of the story builds from what has been done, tested, and maybe thrown out before. So if we're going to talk about North, South, and theory building, and I don't know what else, how do we create that process of learning, of learning not only across borders but across time, right? And I'm I'm really fascinated with this idea of. I mean, if we were to talk about a youth intercultural theory building kind of thing, right? Then it really fascinates me that it's Australia and the UK and America that are have somehow led on that, to which extent does that then have something to do with coloniality? To which extent does that, there's so many questions there that are really crucial for us to think about. And what can we learn from the indigenous knowledge of the South? I don't think there's really not enough going on in the North, to really understand that. And at the same time, we parade Paulo Freire around as if it would be the be all and end all of youth work. So of youth work practice. That was just a little excursion into more philosophical thoughts. But I would be really interested to hear your thoughts on this idea of historical memory in our field.
Well, you've opened a huge
box
for discussion there. I mean, starting with myself around historical memory, which I have a very good one. I do remember things, and I've been around longer than nearly anybody else. So I kind of, but the two things are that I have read very, very widely. I'm surrounded by 6,000 books of my own kind of youth library. But that was partly because I couldn't afford to buy books when I was young, so I offered to review them. And therefore I've published over 1,000 book reviews. And one of the desperate sadnesses for me as an external examiner for youth and community work programs in the United Kingdom, and I have been since the 1980s. In fact, right now is the first year that I am not actively connected to externally examining a youth work course somewhere in the UK. And I've often asked students, tell me one thing, not 20 books, one thing that you read as a student that made a difference to your thinking, that either you hated so much that you wanted to argue back, or you loved so much. And they cannot tell me anything, partly because they don't read. And you mentioned Freire. I mean, one of my recurrent comments in my external examiner reports was, let's not have another assignment which talks about discussed the thinking of Paulo Freire and Antonio Gramsci in relation to youth and community work. Because there is a book called Analysing Community Work by Keith Popple, and students all just go to that, and it's all about Gramsci and Freire, and they just plagiarize that book. I always say, make the assignment, Paulo Freire has nothing to say to a Western European democratic country. Discuss. But that has never been instituted or implemented. So I'm not asking for youth work education and training to become an academic course of sort of intellectual sophistication, but I am horrified at the lack of connection with any kind of literature. I mean, I was chatting to somebody yesterday, and this is not an attack on him, because he was pretty impressive in lots of ways, and has just finished a PhD on international youth work. But he was talking about head, hand, and heart. And I said, do you know Jay McAllister's Bruce work from the 1950s? English female writer but she's written a book called Youth and Youth Groups. And there are 3 chapters amongst about 10 chapters, one of which says youth work through the head, which is about dialogical engagement. Youth work through the heart. No, youth work through the stomach, she says, which is about the role of food in youth work. And youth work through the feet, which is about walking with young people and, taking them to outdoor education and that sort of stuff. And, all I plead is that any youth worker in Europe can point to 5 things that they have read during either formal learning or non-formal learning that influence their practice and influence what they do and influence why they do it the way they do it. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be the same as me. But, you know, you know my old joke, which is I started life as a pioneer and I end up as a historian because I am the only one who remembers a lot of these things. And I'm very sad that that is the case.
Yeah. Yeah. I can empathize with that. I really can.
One more very small point, which is really about, your point was about contemporaneous connection, global north, global south, you know, German language, English language, and there's also historical connection. And I think the important message is that just because a piece of literature is old doesn't mean it's out of date.
No, absolutely not. Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Well, that brings us to a question that I always like to ask, which is, what are you reading right now? Oh, and it doesn't have to be a youth research piece.
No, I've always got a number of things lying around the house, which usually have bookmarks in, and I think, my word, am I still only that short way into that particular book. I did plow my way over Christmas through a very, very huge book, The Definitive History of the International Brigades in the Spanish Civil War by Giles Tremlett. And because every single international brigadier is now dead, but I knew a lot of them in the 1980s because I wrote an oral history about one of them in the 1980s. And then I went to lots of meetings and reunions and memorial events and so on. It was a very meaningful book to read because people were in there who were mentioned I have physically met. So I've got my personal photographs of them, you know, old men in their 70s when I met them. But so that was a gripping story, and I learned so much. I thought I knew a lot about the Spanish Civil War, but I learned a lot more reading that book. I've just reviewed Daniel Briggs' book on climate changed, about the business of misery, which is about refugees and about climate driving migrants towards Western Europe, and the business of misery that, you know, at every step of their journey, there's an opportunity for exploitation and entrepreneurship. Peter Oborn, a very right-wing writer for the Daily Telegraph, and he writes for Middle Eastern Eye as well these days. And strangely enough, a mate of mine who does odd jobs for me went to Palestine a couple of years ago and met Peter Oborn in the walled-off hotel, in Banksy's hotel by the partition wall in Bethlehem. And Alan came back and he told me he'd met Peter Oborn, and I said something about, oh, that fascist. And Alan said, no, he seemed quite a decent guy. And Peter Oborn he's a Brexiteer. He's a very right-wing, has been a right-wing writer, but he's just written a book which starts off with, how did the British electorate manage to vote in a pathological liar as Prime Minister? And so it basically talks about Boris Johnson has never spoken a word of truth in his life, and somehow and will continue to lie. And it's about the corrosion of democracy through falsehoods that are being peddled by members of parliament with no accountability for the lies that they peddle. It's really, really good little book. And the very last thing, because it was my birthday a couple of weeks ago, my daughter sent me a book which is about North Wales and Snowdonia, and it's about walks that you can do in Snowdonia, but it's also about photography. So it's beautiful photographs of the mountains, but it tells you that this was taken with a Canon something or other, with a 25 to 70 lens, and because I've got an interest in my life about photography, and I know Snowdonia very well, it's a beautiful book to have. So, you know, lots of different things going on. Really. Things. Yeah, and actually, not one of them is anything about youth work.
Yeah, true. But it just goes to show how different influences can help us to understand things. No? To conclude, and simply to round it off, we've been asking everybody what they would say to our field, to our sector, if they could speak absolutely frankly. So what would be your frankly, the famous last question, as it were?
Well, of course, somebody close to both of our hearts was Peter Larrittson, and he used to talk about this tolerance of ambiguity. Yeah. And I think we do have the potential to be a community of practice, but I think there are risks attached to that, and the risks come from an arrogant belief that your particular version of youth work is the better one. And different sectors within the community of practice have different power and resources and authority. And I think that what I'd like to say to them is bring less well-resourced, bring less informed, bring, more marginal parts of our community practice closer to us and nearer the center, rather than dismissing them as being less relevant to our agenda and trying to advance our own particular cause.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Thank you, Howard. Nat, that was a bit of a tour de force. It was a longer conversation and a very insightful one. A very, I picked up on a couple of really interesting ideas, and you always give me food for thought. So I really appreciate that that we had this opportunity, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you, Yael. A pleasure.